sans plus attendre, je vous laisse avec eux. Et merci beaucoup, Ludovic, d'avoir pu être présent aujourd'hui. Merci, Daniel. Merci à vous.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Just want to start, this is 15 years since my first exhibition, which was in the exact same space. And it's amazing as an artist to grow kind of up with a gallery in a way, and also to have the support, right, of all of the staff here from the gallery, as well as my own staff, who helped execute these exhibitions. In addition, I'm going to get into this later, but this project was a bit different for me because all of the works, except for the drawings, were produced here in France in the RMN workshop. And I've never made anything in this way outside the studio like that. So I'm very grateful to all of them as well. So I figured that the way that we can structure this talk, I kind of shortened down the typical lecture that I did to go through some of the earliest works and how I arrived at this place. And we're fortunate to have Ludovic here to also shed light on some of the works that I've remade that are from classical antiquity as well. So jump in whenever you want, yeah. So I studied actually painting in school, not sculpture, and many of the earliest works that I produced were a mixture of architecture and landscape. And often these works were mixing the two, creating a kind of fictional narrative in a way, where the architecture was often in a state of decay, but also looked perfect. So you could have this sense that the architecture was either falling apart or it was actually in a state of being built. I grew up in Miami, very much in the natural part of Miami, not everything that you see when you go for Art Basel. Really like in the swamp, and this place was very productive to me as an idea in my work, and I made a lot of paintings about this place. One of the things that was important to me in a lot of the early works was this insistence that the works could kind of float in time. So there was never images of people or any other references to a particular moment. So you could look at this work, you could say the object or the architecture in it was maybe human-made, but you couldn't say the time period. It could have been 1,000 years in the future or 1,000 years in the past. And that idea about a kind of dislocation of time within the works has been prevalent in my practice for the last 20 years. Following this kind of alteration of the landscape, this was a very early series of paintings that were kind of my first, and in a way very much related to the works here in the show, my first kind of stab at the alteration of a historical nature, right? So going back into to works from antiquity. I don't know if you want to say anything particularly about this work.
Yes, I knew it a little bit later. You produced it in 2010, if I remember well. Yeah. And I got it by friends from Palais de Tokyo maybe 7 years later. But it was the first time that you came up in our field in the Louvre, because even though we are supposed to be extremely conservative, we look carefully at what's coming up concerning the reception of antiquity. And I was very pleased to see this very efficient relationship between a standard for us in the Capitoline Museum and your sense of architecture. So that was my my first experience about your work, if not the first one.
So these are works actually from the first exhibition that I did, the first solo exhibition that I did with Emmanuel in 2005. And the works were, if you imagine the paintings as a kind of natural scenario with an architectural kind of intervention within them, the architectural works were the opposite. So it was an architectural scenario with a natural kind of decay or formation happening within them. But you can still see this idea that the columns look broken, but they could also be growing together, right, to some kind of completion. And I began experimenting a lot with this kind of decay into the surface of architecture. This was a work shown at PS1 in New York in 2005 as well. And thinking also about, when we think often about sculpture, there's sort of two general processes that we think about. An additive sculpture, which would be like taking clay and forming it, or a subtractive sculpture, which would be like a block of stone and you find the work within that. This was a project thinking about architecture in that way. So I began with a solid and excavated out this space over the course of 6 weeks. I've done similar things more recently, thinking about furniture in this way. So starting with a block, carving some out, sitting in it, carving more. But this idea about subtraction and addition has been prevalent in the work throughout. A little conversation in between working. A little over 10 years ago, I made a trip in Easter Island, which is a very isolated island in the South Pacific that has a series of stone statues, which are, I would say, I don't know if you agree, but one of the few points of real dispute about the origin of the statues, about how they were made, how they were transported, and this discussion is kind of ongoing. And I found that in archaeology, we are told a story, and the story is inherently a piecing together of different clues. Sometimes we have a lot of clues, and sometimes we have less. And that idea about archaeology becoming a kind of narrative and something that we could think of as being constructed in the future, I started to think a lot about reverse engineering archaeology. So could I take something from the present and sort of artificially push it into the future? Certainly I could have taken an object and kind of painted it to look old. But for me, it was always about a kind of material transformation. This is one of the first objects that I made of that series that I considered a completed piece, which was made of crushed stone and was reformed into the image of a camera. Certainly, I could have taken the original camera and kind of painted it to look old, like a trompe-l'oeil effect. But something about the kind of material quality of these works and the works which you'll see in the exhibition also kind of tells a story, right, about the objects. They're not just degrading, they're made of crystal, which is a material that we associate with a kind of like a geological time frame. And so the objects that I picked were often very iconic things that we would associate with a particular time period that we know were located not 500 years ago, right? They're identifiable. And they were also identifiable kind of globally. So I've always made a point to kind of pick things that when I would show in Brazil or in Japan or here or in New York, they kind of mean a similar thing. Obviously, this work shown here or in New York or in Tokyo, anywhere, we know what it is, we know where it's from, we know the era in which it was, and for many of us, it represents a certain kind of thing. So I experimented a lot with material transformation, using a number of different materials in the work, and expanding the scale also of these pieces. This was the first instance in which, I had created the archaeological object, and this was a kind of fictional archaeological site in which the floor was actually dug out, and underneath were thousands of these objects reformed in volcanic ash and crystal. And I think anytime that you have the opportunity to kind of look at objects from your own your own life, right, your own experience with this kind of bizarre perspective of time, there's a strange dislocation about that. It can be uncanny, you know. I mean, this object is already a future relic. It's only, you know, 30 years old. And also thinking about, you know, more kind of pop cultural icons that represent something as well. So in the selection of objects for an exhibition, I often tried to focus them down into a group of things that had a kind of like-minded relationship. So things related to sports, things related to music, made a whole show. Actually, this one is more related with our discussion. I forgot this slide was in there. This work you saw as well.
Yes, yes. Actually, that was also something that has been provided by my colleagues of Palais Tokyo. I remember that because the model is very famous for us.
This one.
Of course. It's a total landmark of Hellenistic sculpture. And what I thought, but it is only my point of view and I'm not in your head, is that, well, it's a good choice because if you consider Greek sculpture generally as a whole, most of the stances are more idealistic. In this case, this is a very peculiar moment of Greek sculpture where you show the enemy, basically a barbarian about to die or dying. So this is why the title of the piece is The Dying Goal. And in a way, this is more endable to get a balance between an icon of antiquity and the way to reset it in a different form, because the stance has something more in common with what we can figure out altogether. Yeah. But maybe I'm wrong.
It struck me as quite rare, the position, certainly, and you know, the direct relationship with this kind of contemporary figure that obviously sandals and Nikes, it's a different you know, kind of era. I wouldn't say, obviously, you're here as the scholar, that my knowledge about the position of it was more intuitive than it was about a kind of total selection, right? Mm-hmm. So let me get through kind of the rest of these, and then we can talk about the works in the show. But obviously, you know, these markers of an era were important to me to interject within the work. So in the selection of objects, you know, I was often very interested in thinking about icons, right, of a particular era. And I knew I wanted to do a car at some point. And being a fan of cinema, this car is both an icon in its own right? The DeLorean was this kind of failure of a futuristic concept to begin with, but also an icon in cinema. So I did make a complete work out of this, which was the largest kind of cast sculptural object that I had made at that point. And in order to make this, we actually had to disassemble the entire car, take the engine out, cast every section, and then reform it back onto the existing chassis. This work was originally shown 2 years ago in an exhibition in Emmanuel's Gallery in New York, along with another car, which is this famous one. Too bad the sound is not working on here, but we know the story about the car in this one, the 1961 Ferrari GT, which was extremely rare, and only 55 of these cars had been produced originally, so obviously very difficult to come across one of these. So in researching the film, the car that he's kicking is not a real 1961 Ferrari. They hired a prop master to create a mold of an actual car that they had. So that when you see the car earlier in the film parked in the garage, that's the real car. they made a mold of that and created 2 working replicas of the car. In the end of credits of the film, I found this guy. I tracked him down, and he still is around. And I called him up, and I said, "Do you have the mold by any chance of the 61 Ferrari?" He said, "Yeah, I have this mold." So I made the mold, I made the work based on not only the original 61 Ferrari, but it's the exact one from the film as well. This is a recent project in China, in Shanghai, kind of expanding on this idea about the archaeological site, right? A total reimagination of the archaeological site where each day these objects were uncovered, brought into an adjacent laboratory where they were actually, the broken pieces were kind of reformed, maybe similar to what you guys do.
This is the way we do when we excavate ourselves, and every day you go on the field, you grab something else, and you go to the lab during the afternoon after a nap. Basically, you wake up very early, you try to find something, then you nap because you're dead, and then you go to the lab and you reform things and you try to find the fragments that fit together to reconstruct a form. So to me, it was in a very symbolic way, maybe not on purpose, but quite the logic that we have on the field when we excavate in Greece or in Asia Minor, for instance.
Yeah. Next time I do this, I have to add the nap in to the the procedure. But this is so the laboratory was completely constructed, and really I tried to complete this kind of full fiction, right? Where we produced these kind of checklists and documents that every single object was cataloged, given a reference number, placed in the shelf, all of that. So as close as I could get without ever having been in one of those places. And we further confused the time period by having all of the computers in there being 1983 working Mac computers. These were the carbon copy sheets that the people working would make the drawing, archive it, all of that. So now we arrive to this exhibition. So as I said before, I'm working on an exhibition here in a very large encyclopedic museum in France for later this year. And I went to visit the warehouse where they keep all of the molds. And why do they make these molds? So one obviously is an area of study, so that these can be distributed to other schools and things like that. And the other is one of preservation, right? To ensure that these works, nothing's ever going to happen to the Venus de Milo, but that it's protected in that way. And when I arrived, I was looking primarily at Asian antiquities, but I saw all of these objects from Greek antiquity and other things, and I sort of said, can I use that for this project? And I think some of them are here. I could tell they were a little bit skeptical of my process, but over time we convinced them. And also the material that I use for my casting is different from what they would ever apply to their molds. So there was a process of testing. So I made a selection of works and made studies of all the drawings. So these drawings, you can see them in the exhibition, and they usually include some kind of notes. Typically I'll make these drawings in the studio because when we do the casting, the mold is closed, so we cannot see inside of it. And in order to prepare for that, I make drawings of the location of where I want the erosion to happen for aesthetic reasons in some way, and others are structural reasons, right? If I make a huge erosion on one part of a limb, it's going to be fragile on the other end. And I haven't ever shown these drawings before, and it was kind of a last-minute addition to the show, but one of the interesting things about seeing them in the context of the show is the kind of fictional narrative also that's written into the works. And the sort of selection of works that I made, some of which are from your collection at the Louvre, and others are hugely famous works from classical antiquity. This work is a drawing of the Melpomene, which has its own sort of interesting, complex history. Maybe we should discuss the. Let me see if I have the Melpomene, or maybe Lucius Verus. Maybe we want to discuss this one a little bit.
Yes, why not? What you should know, we didn't discuss, as Daniel said, before the selection. We met later on. So there is no, in this selection, there is no scholar guidelines. And to us, it's super interesting to figure out how you select your pieces in RMN storerooms, which embodies a classical antiquity according to you. As a result, it's exactly what we would select to have a good I would say range.
Yeah.
And this one is a very emblematic portrait of Lucius Verus, who is a good guy, but maybe you didn't know that. That is, but because in your selection, you have the scope, you have the good guy and the bad guy. You have Lucius Verus, who has been adopted by Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, emperor. He should have been a very nice emperor and so on, but he died, unfortunately, too young at a young age. And then the Roman issued portraits to celebrate the emperor he could have been, actually. This is a post-mortem portrait. And later on in your selection, we see Caracalla, who is definitely one of the tougher emperor of the Roman history. So it was interesting also for me that you pick up, possibly without any intention, some very different state of mind concerning Roman sculpture. And there is also the idea of the scale, because this one is colossal. And I noticed that you had a very careful look at scales concerning our collection or the reproduction of our collection in the RMN storeroom. And this one is exceptional for that too. And maybe it goes very well along with the Melpomene that we're going to see later on. And,
yeah. I mean, one of the things was, when you see many of these works in the museum, the position of them is important, right? So if they're at eye level, meaning one thing, they're elevated, it's another. And also the taste of this, you were talking to me yesterday about how in the 19th century, if you visited the Louvre, many of the works that you can see today, which are low, were actually on like very tall pedestals. So the Lucius Verus, which you'll see in the gallery exhibition, this one is quite low. It's face to face, you can see it up close. The other thing that I changed, this was obviously cast off of a larger work, right, at some point. And the base of these, which is a more kind of neoclassical base with a plaque, I uniformly made all of the bases in the exhibition the same. So they're all this very kind of simple square base. So this is the Melpomene. It's just a bust of the figure. But the original, I did put a picture in here. Sorry, I'm skipping around, but this is the original Melpomene, which is a work from antiquity, but wasn't found like that.
Yes, there is also this point. You're changing the form of the sculpture that we know, but it is also important to understand, and maybe this is not quite clear for anybody, which I would understand quite well, that they have a long history already. And this one has been found in Campo Marzio in Rome, next to the Pompey Theatre, which was the first and biggest Roman theatre made of stone during Roman antiquity, 1st century BC. And this muse was part of the decorum of this theatre. And it has been found with the head and the body, but not the arm. So the arms and the mask of the tragedy are a restoration of the 18th century, and the statue became famous as a whole like that. Yeah. And then you choose part of the statue for your own work. So to me, this is this way the antique go from one state to the other, which makes sense totally.
But sometimes, you know, for me, the other kind of larger project about this, and where I saw an opportunity in this project, is many times when we visit a museum, the description of the work, the position of it in time is told to us, and we sort of take it as definitive. But as we discussed, the opinion about the origin of the objects, its position in time, even the idea about restoration. You know, this work was, as you say, restored in the 18th century. So the arm was added with the mask, but the mask didn't exist and was a kind of invention of whichever artist did that, right?
Yes, and actually it's not a right restoration. It's surely a muse, but it's probably not Melpomene, the tragedy muse. It's more probably Euterpe. And in the 18th century, for the worst or the best, they always tried to make an antique complete. Sometimes they were accurate, sometimes they made some mistake. And in this case, they should have had 2 arms with 2 pipes for Euterpe. Nowadays, we do not touch so much the 18th century, 17th or 18th century implement anymore. But during the 20th century, there was a huge campaign to remove it.
To remove the
restoration. Yeah. That is what we call unrestoration or de-restoration. And it could have been also it could have been the case for the Venus d'Arles. Yeah. It's a very famous antique found in Arles, in the theater of Arles, in 1651. And then in Arles, they understood that it would be a good idea to send it to Louis XIV to be well in court. Yes. So it became a masterpiece of the Galerie des Glaces in Versailles, and the first sculptor of Louis XIV, François Girardon, was hired to complete the statue and invent the 2 arms. In the mid-20th century, the Louvre, the firm, we were about to remove these complements because they are not so accurate. Typical Venus wouldn't have 2 attributes, but only one, not the golden apple and the mirror in the same time. So when you read the archive, you can understand that there was a debate to maybe remove those complements, but because it was François Girardon and Louis XIV, I would say the weight of history was too strong. So it's true that we are talking about what do we do with these icons, and is it possible to change it? I answered. No, I received just before coming a message on my telephone because I posted this picture. Yeah. And the sculptor, probably very academic, was terribly upset. And he said, but how just dare you, curator of a national museum, support such a process, because it's not possible to touch antiquity and masterpieces. Well.
Did you remind him about Girardon?
Yes, I did. Well, it's just first super conservative, but it's not surprising. On the other hand, it's a good clue to understand that most of the audience does not understand that even the antique is something flexible and endable, and it has changed, and sometimes we restore it and we change it again. So your process to us is totally logical, because even if an antique is not should be everlasting, it's a moving body in a way.
I mean, that's why this work for me was one of the more complex and interesting works in the exhibition. Has all of this history bound up with it. As you said, it was found. It's a work from antiquity. It's like over 2,000 years old, I guess. When it was restored, so we talked about the addition of the arms. There were cracks in the folds of the fabric as well, which were 18th century additions, as well as the position of the head, right? So when you see the work in the gallery next door, look closely at the neck, because you can see the repair of the neck is present in the sculpture. Mm-hmm. But the decision so you have a work from antiquity, which was then altered or restored in the 18th century, and the 20th century de-restoration of it only removed the things that they thought were not kind of important to it, which is, it's just, when we think about history, I like this idea that this is a proof of its flexibility in a way.
Yes, the only thing what we did, it was in the late 80s, I was not in charge, it was my professor. We only changed the position of the head because we knew that it was a difficult part of the statue for Girardon. So we removed the head and we try to find the very right contact points, and we slightly changed the direction of the head, and you knew the record. I was delighted to know that, actually. And so it's a good example of this flexibility. But on the other hand, you know that to me this picture is also a little bit a nightmare because I'm a curator. It's, well, changing the pieces, it's nice, but our DNA is to keep the piece. Of course, we can change the restoration, we can unrestore and so on, but the original surface, we have to keep it as it is. And you imagine what it could be in 1,000 years when the museum is almost destroyed. So to me, of course, it's a little bit striking, but in 3020, I will be dead.
Yeah. These are some images that you brought up.
Yes, it was my little contribution because when we look at your pieces together, I thought to myself, well, there is also a natural way to get this type of effect. I mean, an erosion, and especially concerning antique marbles that you find in shipwreck, because they are under the sea. The statue stay or lay under the sea, and this is a wonderful case because they stayed under the sea, half under the sand, half in the water, the salted water actually. And during many years in the National Museum in Athens, those statues were not so well praised because they were altered. But nowadays they become famous because this half situation, like a Joker statue, is becoming very seducing. So there are the statue from Antiquity, and this is not exactly a total comparison with your work, but it's not so far, and maybe this is even better.
The other one that you gave me was
a little bit later. Yes, this is a portrait of the Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire, that has been found in Fos near Marseille in 1987, if I remember well, by a fisherman. So by a pure matter of chance. And now it's in the Musée de l'Art Antique in southern France. It's a colossal head. So it's like type of the scale that like you Lucille. Choose, yes, for Melpomene, Lucius Verus, and Lucilla, especially Lucilla. That piece came to the Louvre for an exhibition 5 or 6 years ago. I knew it, but it was the very first time we put it on display in the Louvre. And in this case, the erosion is very close to your taste, especially when you see the details, because this is because of salt, but also because of sea worms that produce those little holes. And on the cheekbone, here on the right, you can see that under the surface, you can imagine the structure of the marble itself, and this network of crystal, which is not so far from all the quartzite and the crystal that you include in your work. And for me, I don't know if it's, but it's only my opinion as a scholar dealing with antiquity. You're dealing with copies in limestone or in plaster, produced by Réunion des Musées Nationaux. So you got the best workshop in the world, by the way, because we work with them and they are the only one to touch our originals.
I agree.
But the original is in marble, and the marble is a very special and beautiful stone. It's the reason why the Greeks were just in love with marble. It's because it's metamorphic, it's crystallized, and your mix of plaster and quartzite and crystal, it's a way to, for me,
To reference the original.
to refer to the original in a very beautiful way, because it's not literal, it's like a contrast. And in this case, this is what you see naturally. That is why I picked up this picture to show it to you.
So maybe the last work that we can talk about, which is actually the oldest work in the exhibition, is this piece. So in the selection of images, as you were saying before, part of the reason I picked certain works was the period of time in which they were made. Others were based on an aesthetic decision. So some works in the exhibition are very well known, and others are more unknown. In fact, the Caracalla, you said, was part of the Louvre collection, but not even on view, right? No. This one was selected because actually it's the oldest work in the exhibition, and as you say, it forms a kind of bridge between two sort of eras of sculptural, like Greek sculptural tradition. So this was my version of it. This is the original, which is
Yes.
in the Louvre.
Yes, this is in the very middle of our first gallery in the Greek and Roman department, and I was very surprised to see it in your selection. Then I understood that your time scope was pretty wide, but maybe by a pure matter of chance, or I don't know, you picked up what is a total landmark for us, because the Lady of Auxerre is understood as the first comeback to Greek people to sculpture, because we all know the Cycladic sculptures, the very beautiful pure forms from the 3rd millennium BC, but this is Bronze Age, and this is not really Greek civilization. Then there is a big gap, and then little by little, the Greeks start again to produce some sculpture in limestone to start, not in marble because it was too difficult for them. They started with limestone. So this one, any student dealing with Greek art in School of the Louvre, for instance, to quote the one that I try to focus on this type of pieces, should know it, but it's not very well known. I guess that in the audience, Lady of Auxerre is not a total best, but it is actually. So, maybe by chance, or because you have a good radar, you choose basically the very one, the first in line when you study, I would say, a book about Greek sculpture. You start with that.
And for you, what's so extraordinary about this work in relation to some of the Cycladic pieces or the works following? Because this is 7th century, I think?
7th century BC. It's a moment Greek cities reform themselves and try to get organized, to have workshops and to produce new sculpture. And they are not so well advanced. And to me, what is important also is that in Western country, we have a notion of Greek art as something wonderful, the roots of our civilization, or the forgotten roots nowadays, probably, but still. And it's a total mistake because the Greeks themselves understood clearly that other civilizations around, especially East, were much more advanced. Thank you. And this sculpture, which is the starting point of Greek sculpture, so some say Western civilization, and we live in a super focused Western-oriented way of thinking, is quoting an Egyptian wig and a Syrian belt. So it's also important that
the sculpture is actually referencing things before
it's referencing to something that exists before. And again, you play with or you act with a material which is already the result of a long process, and to me it's totally meaningful. But to me.
Okay, so I think we're kind of at the point where we can sort of open it up, unless there was anything specific you wanted to do. I don't know if there's any questions.
I just want maybe I wanted to pay a tribute to you. There is a very last one.
This one? Okay.
Yes. This is a painting in the Louvre by Gian Paolo Panini, painted in 1756 or 8, I don't remember anymore. During the 18th century, it was super fashionable to have this type of painting with all the antiques that were very famous in Rome, like the Laocoon, the Borghese vase, the Medici vase, the Apollo from the Belvedere, and you see all those actual antiques around the painting itself. And in the selection, on the first plan, you see your dying goal. So it's a way to go back to your one of your first connection with antiquity.
Yeah.
And I guess also that in a way, this exhibition on a very different level is a little bit a Panini, but a very personal one. So, and for my part, this is a compliment.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.